Welcome to the Love Does podcast. My name is Jody Luke, and I'm the executive director of Love Does. And Love Does cares for the vulnerable, fights for human rights, and provides education in conflict zones. One of the most difficult places to have a school right now is Afghanistan. And we have a beautiful school, beautiful primary school in Afghanistan that we started years ago, and we had to close it briefly while the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan. And then we were able to reopen it several months later due to the tremendous leadership by our guest on today's podcast. Aref has held numerous positions in government and diplomatic positions. He is a published author, an esteemed advisor, and currently is asked to speak all the time in front of government officials and as a part of university symposiums. I love to listen in via Zoom as much as possible because I learn so much. His wife, Sophia, who I love, she's fantastic, was recently asked to speak in front of The Hague, which is the International Court for the UN, on behalf of Afghan women. But what's so remarkable about Aref is not how off the chart smart he is, which he really is, but how he leads with thoughtfulness and kindness. And he's one of the most unselfish leaders I think I've ever encountered. We've shared a few really heavy moments in the last several years and a lot of joyful ones. I prefer the latter. I love it when Aref smiles. I always feel like that's a huge win, or Sophia smiles. And Ref, I have the deepest respect for you, and it really is my honor to have you on the podcast today. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Judy. So good to be here with you. And thank you so much for those kind words. I will take them as prescriptions.
Great. You take them that way. Well, tell us a little bit about you, how you got to the U.S., and what you're doing now.
I got to the US partly, I blame it on the Pepperdine University
Mm.
because they gave an admission and also a scholarship to my wife, Sophia. And then I visited the campus. And they showed me the ocean from the top of the hill, and also they're just so kind people, and nobody can resist that when you go to Malibu. And so I resigned from my work in Kabul,
And what were
and
you doing there? What were you doing there at the time?
at the time I was working with our government. I was leading our international relations at the National Security Council, and it was a job that I really loved. And it was not easy to leave it. And I felt like I was contributing. I was part of something bigger, and it was just really fulfilling to be in that role. But then family, I have spoken with you a lot, comes first to me. I had made a promise to my wife before we got married that if she allowed me to work in government for a few years, then I would support her to do a graduate degree. And
Mm.
Pepperdine just made that possible, and held me to my own words. And I resigned. We came here. But also, when our government knew that I was coming to Los Angeles, there was a post that was becoming vacant just around the same time. So they then designated me as the consul general in Los Angeles. And so I spent a few months at Pepperdine, and then I moved to that role.
And you
Um,
had diplomatic plates even.
I
You
did.
were, yeah.
And I was thankful for that. Initially, we were thinking we would be here for about a year. Because of my designation to the consulate, turned into 3 years. But of course, we couldn't finish that time because some tragic events
Mm.
unfolded in our country back in Afghanistan. And as you pointed out in the beginning, the regime changed. And then our plans just crumbled,
Mm. Mm.
and we had to figure out what we would do next. And that's when the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, where I
Wow.
had done a degree many years before, invited me for a time of transition. And I think they little knew at the time that they would get stuck with me. So it's been 2 years and I'm still here. But we have started a program that I really love and totally own it. I'm really grateful to be here. I think that this is the best place that I could be at this time after what happened
So you went from
with the
Malibu, Los
previous one.
Angeles to South Bend, right?
Indiana, yes.
Yes. So let's go back. Maybe it's about 6 years ago, which is hard for me to believe. And you received a call from Bob. Bob Goff is the founder of Love Does, wrote the best selling book, Love Does. And he called you, and I don't think you thought it was legitimate at first. Tell us about that call and then what transpired after that.
Well, one of my really close friends, Licia Porter, who had worked with us in Afghanistan, she somehow knew Bob and connected us via email. And I did not know about Love Does at the time. And I had long had a passion to do something for kids,
Mm,
particularly what I shared with Bob. Bob replied to the email and showed interest. And so I told him about this city that had fallen for the first time, a city that had fallen to the Taliban during the former government. And about 20,000 families were displaced. And among them were about 60% children.
mm,
In total, there were like 100,000 people, and 60,000 of them were children. So I just shared that with Bob. I said, maybe we cannot do something for 60,000 children, but what if we were able to do something for 60 people? And immediately he was like, when can I call you? And so I shared my phone number and we tried to figure out the time difference because he was in San Diego, I was in Kabul. We found out that we were 12 and a half hours apart from each other. And in a matter of days, we found ourselves talking on the phone. Then he was like, when can I come to Kabul?
mm. Of course.
And of course,
Doesn't everybody say that?
uh, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in a country that is known to be an agricultural country. Even though I haven't had a lot of, I haven't had the privilege of planting trees or doing much with agriculture, but I grew up in that environment. And in that environment, we are taught to cultivate seeds
Mm,
and but also know that there are so many things that are outside of our control, like it snows in my country a lot, and so the crops could just freeze. And so but Bob was like, no, it's just going to be sunny like San Diego. And so he just arrived and then took action really swiftly. 4 months into our conversation, he returned and we did the grand opening of the school, and so many little kids were smiling at the balloons that he brought with him.
always bring balloons. We are aggressive on the doing part. And then right after that, too, you had a dream big. Tell us a little bit about that. It seems pretty wild to have a dream big with Afghan leaders in Kabul, but you all pulled that off.
I think we probably did a couple of those. And in each of those, probably close to 100 people participated.
And why
And
did they want to participate?
you know, this is what makes Afghanistan so beautiful, in my opinion, is because you can see a lot of thirst for change and a lot of thirst for learning and growth. And so when we told these young leaders from around the country, and there are 34 provinces in Afghanistan, we had participants from 34 provinces.
Mm,
Many of them traveled from remote places, and we provided accommodation for them. And there was also, in one instance, there was also a debate tournament that was happening. And so that made it, we were able to do two things at the same time. It made it even more exciting. but people stayed for an extra day. And then the second time, people just traveled, and again, we provided accommodation for them. And they just loved hanging out with Bob and his team and the concepts that he talked about, because these are young people born and brought up during wars and violence, and they want to see something different. And that concept of dreaming big, that this can actually change, and it will change, and you will have a role in it. Let's talk about it. Let's make a plan. Let's take practical steps. That resonated with those people. And they still talk about it. Many
Hmm.
of them talk about it. Some of them, unfortunately, have now evacuated because of what happened in the country, because of the change. It was no longer safe for some of them, so they had to leave the country. But many of them are actually inside the country, and they still talk about it. There's a Facebook group, for example, that people continue to stay connected and exchange ideas, and there are like all the time events that happening, and I hear that when there's something, for example, somebody wants to do in eastern Afghanistan, then they connect with those leaders who were part of the Dream Big. And
Yeah, it was a really that was I remember that being a real highlight during that time. I think I met you pretty quickly after it all started at the National Prayer Breakfast, you and Sophia, and I was immediately blown away. I asked you a million questions, kind of like we're doing right now. And we stayed in touch. A couple years later, as you said, you had moved to Los Angeles to be the Afghan consul to the Western US. I was taking a trip with my daughter. She was 12, almost 13 at the time, and you graciously invited us over for dinner. Uh, and that was in August of 2021. I remember as it was getting closer, I could see that there was some unrest that was happening in Afghanistan. It was starting to get very tense. I remember calling you and saying, "Hey, do you still want to do this, or should we postpone this?" And you said, "No, no, I really want you to still come over." So that day we arrived that evening, and it was really difficult. It was actually the Friday before Kabul fell. We didn't know that at the time, but when I arrived, there was a real heaviness. And I remember you saying that you had sat with Sophia right before we came, and that you had sort of you were stacking your hands and saying, "We're going to be really strong for our family and our friends and for the people that we know at Afghanistan, and we're going to see how we can champion them and help them, but it's going to be on us to be strong." And then we had dinner, and I think again I must have said, "Hey, do you really want us to stay?" And it was such a beautiful dinner. Sophia is a tremendous cook. You did a really great job holding the plates and the ladle. It was a real team effort, not much, but she was it really was the most tasty thing. I remember it. And during that dinner, it was a poignant moment to be in that space at such a pivotal time, I think, in your lives, and ours too. You left several times during that dinner to take phone calls from the government, and trying to advocate and protect your family. And it was scary. It was tense. And I know it's difficult, but can you describe a little bit about that time, and even what happened afterwards, and how you walked through that?
sure, and thank you for asking that question. I remember we also sat down. We said, "Well, should we cancel this dinner?" And one thing we have learned is that we have to live amidst crisis. Because, like I mentioned earlier, in my country, we were born and brought up during uh, really
Mm.
lots of turmoils. And if we keep postponing seeing our friends, then we might do that perpetually and never get to seeing them. But that night was quite unique, and so we didn't know that something that big was going to happen in that moment. Um, and so we decided we'll just make some delicious mantu, the dumplings with the layered toppings,
It was so
so
good.
delicious.
Hmm.
And so anyhow, we were so happy to see you and Lorraine. And the challenge for both of us I think, was to balance between being present with you as our guest and wonderful friends, and at the same time tracking danger that was encroaching, particularly the city where my family were living.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it was about a week before you arrived that the cities in Afghanistan started falling. It wasn't until August 6th. Um, until August 6th, things were bad in more remote places, but not in capital cities. On August 6th, the first city fell. And on August 13th was when we were having dinner. And by August 13th, the city where my family comes from, the city of Mazar Sharif, is one of the four biggest cities in the country, one of the major strongholds of any government. It's a trade city, it's a business city, it's a very strong place. And so it's so strategic. Usually, if that falls, then everywhere else pretty much falls. And if that holds, then a lot of other places do hold.
Hmm.
But that city was now surrounded fully when you and I were having dinner. And my family, some of them had already, I was able to convince them about a week prior to go to Kabul and stay there. But my dad was resisting, and one of
Hmm.
my sisters was resisting. They were like, "No, we're gonna stay here." And my sister was
Hmm.
asking repeatedly, "What if everywhere falls, but not this city? Will we still be able to stay here?" And I tried to tell her that is not going to happen. If everywhere falls, this place will also fall. This is a very key place. Just like go to Kabul, stay there so that we can think through this situation. We cannot worry about your safety and find ways to see where we can be in the future. So just go to Kabul. And Kabul, because Kabul was the capital of the country, the government would guard it with its might. The international forces were present. The U.S. had just was sending another, I don't remember exactly, but like 2 to 3 thousand more forces. But they were sending forces to really guard the airport. And I was still hoping and at the same time communicating with our US colleagues and other international friends and urging them to make sure Kabul doesn't fall, stand with the
Mm-hmm.
government. Um, but there is a broader context to that, and that really made basically one side to stop fighting for the country because they didn't see any reason anymore, rather than more bloodshed that they didn't want to enter or accept without promise of some kind of solution to the
Well, I
problem.
remember that night. So I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget how you treated my daughter because in your fear and certainty, really, you remain kind and generous. And I often think that it's really in times of crisis that you see the real character of people. And you had every reason not to be kind and generous, honestly. You could have cut the night short, and instead you were everything but all things wonderful to her. And, a lot of kids post COVID had a really difficult time, and Lauren included. And in the couple years after that, we would think back on that night and just use it as an example of how to walk through really difficult situations because we saw you do it. And we saw you and Sophia treat people with grace and kindness and generosity. And it made an impact. And I don't think either of us will ever forget it. And I want to thank you for that because I think that will inform so much for her as she looks back on her childhood. That will be a real pivotal point, honestly. That dinner was really remarkable for us. And that being said, it is central to Afghan culture, really is hospitality. Uh, why is that? I see it with a lot of the Afghan refugees that we know here that when, people come over, it's a really important piece of your culture. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and first, please also allow me to say thank you to you because you also and Lorraine stayed that night. I know we were distracted, and but you stayed, and so that just shows your friendship, and we really valued. We didn't feel like we were alone, and I remember the next morning things changed. Our city unfortunately fell that night when you left, and then you brought food for us the next lunch because after that for 3 months we just napped. We couldn't sleep. We were working out of our bedrooms and kitchen and like everywhere. It was just like 24/7 working and trying to respond to the
It's really
crisis.
true. And to that point, in those moments, you want to shoulder the burden for your friends. And we were just pained for you. I mean, we barely slept, I think, that night too, and wanted to do whatever we could to help and support you. And yet you all had to walk through that alone, really. And you did for the next many weeks and months. And you were a real support for so many people. Um, but speak to also just, what it is like in the midst of that to host people, because we see it all the time, even in with Afghan refugees, with just the way that they treat even strangers.
Yes, no, that's great. I think that that is something like an ancient cultural code in Afghanistan, but also in that entire region. Guests are really valuable for us. Um, in every Afghan house, whether it's rented or it's owned, whether it's an apartment or a house, whatever, every Afghan home has a guest room.
Mm.
It's even part of our architecture. And whenever you build a house, there's always a room for guests. And if you can afford it, you actually build a guest house because you want to bring as many people as possible, as much as often as possible to your place, feed them, clothe them, and just share life with them. It's just part of our culture, and it has been there for thousands of years. You could trace it to our literature, to poems and writings that talk about this for a very long time in history.
Well, you have a
And
gift for it, I will say that. And if you don't have an Afghan friend, you should make one, because it really
yes,
is something else to share a meal and to be with you all. I want to also talk, before I forget too, that your family was separated and they went everywhere, all over the world, all different countries. Many of them had to flee for their safety, given the role that you all had played in Afghanistan. And it also speaks once again to your character, because we were talking, not too long ago, that refugees in different countries, it looks different. It doesn't always look like the US or Canada or Europe. Sometimes you're in a camp and you don't have a lot of freedom, and you don't have a lot of ways to get out, and it can feel sometimes pretty lonely, or sometimes kind of trapped, and you don't really know what's going to happen in the future. And that had happened for some of your extended family. And I remember you saying that, I think for almost 2 straight years, you took every single lunch break and you would FaceTime an extended family member, just so that they knew they weren't forgotten. And that in that time, just sharing that presence in that space was hopeful for them.
it was, yes. Afghans breathe in community and with each other. They cannot breathe alone. And
Mm.
so this is so important. And I'm really glad that I was able to do that. And it was not easy, but I had to say no to many, many projects and just prioritize family because that was a big need. It was not easy because after each call, it wasn't just, it was like a 1 hour call, but it would the impact would last for another couple of hours before I could like focus back to
Mm.
my work because to see them in a situation that you cannot do much about was not very easy. So now in the US, in Canada, in other places, my um, one thing I would like to share with people is just like go have tea with people,
Mm.
with Afghans, with your Afghan friends, and if they bring you food, they will bring you a lot of food. Again, it's because of our culture. In our culture, guests are not just invited, anybody can visit. People don't even ask your name. They are actually told not to ask the name because been in conflict for so many years. You don't want to know if someone is on the other side, and then that would impact your hospitality. You just don't want anything to impact your hospitality. But also, if there's one person coming to your home, you prepare food for 10 people, because that
Yes.
person is allowed to invite someone else who's also allowed to invite someone else who's also allowed to invite someone else. So you never know how many people will end up in your home. So you always prepare a lot of food. And people are very happy if you eat that food. And so don't worry, even if you feel like, well, they economically cannot afford this much food, just eat it, because they believe that it will keep coming.
Yes, don't go on an empty or go on an empty stomach
Yes.
for sure. And it is a party. I have been the recipient of that. You know, we helped a lot of Afghan refugees through Love Does with basic needs and then also resettling, many of the families. And it wasn't just a program or a project for us. They really became our friends. And then we've shared lots of moments. We went to Disneyland last year. I remember we were at the Pirates of the Caribbean, and one of the guys was like, "Oh, this seems like a little bit like home." And I was like, "Oh gosh, that was maybe not a good ride for us to go on." But for several of the teenagers, that was the first time they were on roller coasters, and it's really been a joy to share the pumpkin patch or the zoo, the San Diego Zoo, some of these outings, and just uh, sharing time because they matter. And my schedule seems like it's a little crazy at the time, so I don't get to be with them as much as I would like. But it has really been one of the biggest gifts of the last couple of years in making friends with some of the refugees that have come. What else, because there's Ukrainian refugees, obviously Afghan refugees. What is it like for them as they're in a new country and a new place? What are some of the things and some of the challenges that they're facing?
I think that many things are very new. Um, uh, Particularly, I can speak about Afghans, that the way life is done here and the way it's done in Afghanistan, in many respects, is just very different. One of those biggest things is being in community, and being with extended family members. People have tried to stay together. It hasn't worked all the time, but for the most part, in many parts of Afghanistan, that still is the case. And so they can feel a little lonely here when they arrive, because people have busy schedules, and it's not very easy to see each other as often as they would in Afghanistan. And so that is loneliness is probably one of the biggest challenges, and many people like yourselves are doing really a lot of great work trying to reach out to these people, and that means a lot to them. Um, and then there are other practical life things, such as getting into the job market in these countries. In the United States, for example, it's not easy, and it just works very differently. One of the things is that it's so focused, and you have to know exactly, for example, what your skills are and where you fit, and you have to be able to find that. In Afghanistan, it's much broader, and so you can pick a field, for example, and find a place for yourself, and you would be very flexible. In here, the competition is stronger in some senses, because you have
One
had
of the
lots.
ways that I think we've jumped in, because we've seen that as well, um, is with women in particular too, having an opportunity to drive. And so we've
Mm.
helped several of the women to get driver's license because that equals freedom and then the ability to get out and do different things. In fact, and that's the same for the men as well. That many of the Afghan refugees that we get to work with have become Uber drivers or Amazon delivery drivers as they are then going back to school on the side, but just gives some freedom to that. And in fact, even our single mom program, within Love Does, people who have cars or want to give to that particular area is really helpful for us because we are just funneling that to Ukrainian refugees, Afghan refugees, single moms. It really is a game changer with regard to getting into the job market and what that looks like. That being said, in terms of the culture being so different, it really is very different for women. Um,
Mhm.
Living here and getting used to that, but then also those that are still left in Afghanistan. And I know that you and Sophia have worked hard to find creative ways to still give Afghan women a voice that are in Afghanistan. Can you speak a little bit to what it looks like to be, some of the challenges that women face there and kind of what can be done about it?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably never understand as a man, and so they would be best placed to talk about it, women themselves. But I do communicate, and in a lot of our programs, of course, women are an integral part, and we try to create equal opportunities for both. Um, and they describe the situation in ways that are really tragic. For example, just a couple of days ago, I think it was a young woman wrote an article that she described being a woman as like just a moving body but dead inside in
Mm,
Afghanistan. Because what has happened, especially after the change, is that being a woman has turned into a duty. You are told, you're actually given a set of don'ts. These are the things you cannot do. And that's pretty much like everything. And that has taken that freedom that you're talking about totally away from them. And um, and so it has become really difficult. But at the same time, I think that the hope for the situation of women in Afghanistan also comes from themselves. And there are lots of courageous women that are doing a lot of important work, both inside Afghanistan and globally. There are women at the United Nations. The United Nations, over the past couple of years, for example, has given every platform to Afghan women.
mm.
There has not been probably a single man speaking at the United Nations over the past couple of years, and I totally support that. It's
Ah,
been almost similar with the European Union and some of the other international organizations. And again, I support that. I think that should continue. And these women who are based outside of Afghanistan are fiercely advocating for their rights. Um, and I think that it is not an exaggeration what they call it. They describe the situation in the country as a gender apartheid. And they're
mhm.
pushing the United Nations to recognize that and then do something about it. Because right now, the international community, you can ask them on a moral ground. We have to create legal grounds as well so that they hold themselves accountable. They are obliged to do something. There are, of course, international laws and regulations and United Nations resolutions and so forth that they have to work on. But these women are pressing to make that stronger. On the inside, it's the same. Many of them are not so much present online, but on the ground, they are actually doing a lot of work. And we are tracking and we are in communication with many of these movements inside the country. And that's where I actually draw my hope for the situation of women in the
That's really
country.
encouraging, Aref. And I also, not too long ago, you invited me on a Zoom with our school. I had to stay up late to be able to talk to them. I think we were doing a food drop. It was pretty cool. And I was able to talk to some of our female students that were there. And it was really enlightening. It struck me, first of all, just how hard they're working. We're able to still educate girls up to sixth grade per the Taliban's rules. We have to separate them. But as I was having a conversation, I was talking about, what subjects they like and don't like. They are very studious and they still dream. They talked about wanting to still become a doctor and a teacher.
Mm.
And one, it reminded me of the gift of education, that you don't take that for granted because not everybody gets that gift. And they recognize that and want to really take advantage of every opportunity afforded to them. And should there be more opportunities in the future, then they'll be ready to move forward in that and understand the value of what an education means. And that's been really, it's been really encouraging to me that we get to provide that still for them and that oasis. And we were also talking recently about just the school still being up and running, and that was, of all the stuff that you're doing, that was a pretty meaningful thing to you. What are some of the encouraging stories that have come out of our school?
The fact that the school has stayed open is very encouraging because it is providing community and space for these kids that they would otherwise not have it. One of the kids, one of the little girls recently told us, she said she was helping with her dad prepare what they call yahak, which is ice, pieces of ice dipped into sugar and artificial color, turned into some kind of an ice cream, which you can sell in very in an inexpensive price. And so she was helping with her dad do that. And then she said, afterward, I would go to garbage dumps and I would collect plastic bottles, and take them to people who would want to recycle them. And in return, get something, and a small amount of money. And that way I would contribute to my family, but also spend my days. And then she said, luck turned to me.
Hmm.
And luck was in the form of a bus that dropped me in this school. And so you hear all of these stories. There's this other little girl who told us about her vision to become a teacher in the future. Um, and this vision she formed after she joined the school, because she says, these are her words. She says, education and providers are the only hope for our country at this stage. And
Mm,
I want to be part of that hope, spreading that
mm,
hope. She has already started gathering 6 kids in her neighborhood in the garage of her father. She teaches those kids after she goes from school. Our teachers just gave her a whiteboard and some markers because she was using clumps and writing alphabets on the wall for these kids. And now they have a little small whiteboard and gather every evening. She's at school during the day, and then she teaches in the evenings. And um, and so I think it's really important because it also shows our belief and your belief in the future of the country. It's not something that you do and then you get result tomorrow, but it's an investment in the future. And whenever you do investment, it means you have a belief that something big will come out of this investment. And so that belief in the future strengthens, and people can see that. And um, and I think that that is really important. And I just want to thank you, Jody, and I want to thank like all of you at Love Does for sustaining this effort, because a lot of organizations left the country after 2021, and it is still is not easy to continue to work in that country. It is actually very, very challenging, and it's something that we would have like done in an hour now takes easily a week or 2 weeks to get done, because how difficult things are both inside the country but also internationally. It's not easy to get resources, for example, into the country. All the time you have to be thinking creatively and find new ways to work around those challenges. So I'm just really, really appreciative. All of these kids are very grateful. All of the teachers are really grateful. It is a place where not only those people, but anyone else that sees it, sees hope and sees the future.
I do love that education equals hope. And I love your recent request. You said, This place is an oasis, and I would love to put a playground here," which is
Yes.
a very Love Does thing to do. It's hard for me to imagine a playground at this school, but I think it needs to happen, and to have kids laughing and have joy. And in the midst of trauma, that's so important. It's so important for your brain chemistry. It's so important for growth. And I think it's a great idea. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we'll figure out a way
Yes.
to do that, because I think it's a pretty cool idea. Well, you have a young son, and he's growing up. I know your heart is to get back to Afghanistan. That's not going to happen anytime soon, but hopefully at one point it will. What will you tell him as he grows up about the Afghanistan that you knew and the one that you hope for?
He is. We named him Diyar, which means homeland.
Hmm.
And we didn't know at the time when we were supposed to think about what name to give him is when the country fell. So we didn't know what we would call him until just a couple of days probably before his birth. And we're like thinking, okay, what are we going to name him? Because in the hospital they will ask what name to put in the certificate. What are we going to
Yeah.
say? And then we were looking through some names, and then Dior caught our eyes, and but also our hearts. And immediately we knew, we said Diyar because it means homeland. But I'm also thinking that it's going to put a lot of responsibility on his shoulders, because he will carry that name throughout his life. And so that name will actually give him a lot of messages, and that he will ask questions. Hopefully, why? What his name means? Why we named him this? And that we will tell him about the story. But my hope is that he will be able, like all of us, will be able to be back in the country, that this situation does not last forever. And I do hope that it doesn't last forever. Good thing in Afghanistan is that change is always constant. Change is always constant, actually. Change always comes. We've seen it before our eyes. Um, and, and, and my hope is for him to be part of creating positive change, and doing good for our people here, and also back in Afghanistan
Well, that's my
in the
hope
future.
as well. I remember not too long ago, you were in San Diego and we got to host you
Mhm.
for dinner at our house. And my husband, we were going around the table, and I think he asked a silly question. I think he said, what's everybody's super secret power?" And I think I said mine was multitasking or something. I don't know what it was. And I think you said, if I remember right, it was being a strategizer, being strategic. And I really think that that's true. I think you're good at that, but I think you're a lot more also. And, Love Does tries to show up in some really difficult places and figure out how to love their neighbor well. I think you really exemplify that. And you have accomplished a lot in your life. You have endured a lot. But I think what you're going to be known for at the end of your life is how you've loved your people. You've loved Afghan people, and you've really loved all people. And I've been a recipient of that. And I am really so grateful for the friendship of you and Sophia. And I hope it lasts for decades longer. But, thank you. Thank you for the relationship, and thank you for the way that you bear the burdens of lots of people and love them so well. So, and thanks for your time today. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and how you shared everything. And we're hoping with you.
Thank you so much, Jody. And I'm also really grateful that a long distance phone call, turned into a firm friendship, and I'm really proud of it. It will last. Thank you so much.
Agreed. See you later.
See you.